Hello everyone. I'm very happy to finally have a look at the London Underground today with you all. It's been a while since this has been suggested, and I finally made it to London. Still have my Oyster card, visitor card here from Transport for London. And we're going to dive a little bit into the history today. Before we start, I'd also quickly like to say thank you to Christian, Nick and Isabel for donating to my traveling budget, or my shopping budget more specifically. I have definitely made good use of it, and also a big thank you to everyone who suggested places to go and where to find maps. It's been a very successful trip, so let's get into it. The map that we're going to have a look at today is a diagrammatic history map. This one's by Douglas Rose, and I think this is the 9th edition, if I'm not mistaken. It's not a map of the underground per se, so you won't see all of the lines. Instead, it's a map of the stations. The dates when they opened, when they were renamed, recited, or closed. Every date you could possibly want to know in one place. And honestly, that's quite a lot of dates, as you'll see in a moment. Alright, as you can tell, it's almost a bit too big for our recording setup, but we'll make do. Now, the fascinating part about the London Underground, of course, is just how old it is. It was the first underground in the world, dating back to the middle of the 19th century, specifically to 1863, when the Metropolitan line opened here in this area from Paddington to Farringdon. Metropolitan today, or short Metro, has become synonymous with the underground, and for example in Paris the underground is actually called Le Métro, after the Metropolitan. Shortly after the Metropolitan, the Metropolitan District line also opened, which would have been this part here. And then very early on we have a kind of circle around the city of London. Now, the reason that this circle was built in the first place goes back a bit further. In the 19th century, London was growing very, very fast. So the centre was already quite crowded. And then, of course, you have the new technology of the rail, and you have a lot of rail lines bringing people in towards the centre, adding to this congestion in the streets of London. And we had an incredible 15 different terminal stations around this square mile of the city. We'll just go through them for a second. We have St. Pancras and King's Cross, which are two different stations historically. When we continue in this area, we have Broad Street, which I think is not on this plan anymore. It's been changed into an area called Broadgate, so redeveloped. We have Liverpool Street, then Fenchurch Street, which I also can't see here. It might be because it's a railway station and those were not included on this map. These are only underground stations. So if the underground never stopped there, it's not included on the map. We have London Bridge down here, Cannon Street a little further up. We have Holborn Viaduct, which I'm not sure if it's the same as Holborn right here, or whether maybe it was a bit further south. It has been replaced by a different stop called Thameslink, but that's also not included on this map as it's not part of the underground. But anyway, it's here in this area. Then we have Blackfriars, Waterloo, Charing Cross, Victoria. Then we're going to jump up here towards Paddington, Marylebone and Euston. And you can see, with the exception of Holborn, where I'm not sure whether this was here or somewhere else, you can see that we have almost a circle around the City of London. It was not allowed to build a central station, which added to this problem. But of course, one of the solutions that were proposed was to create a circle line. And the circle started with the Metropolitan line. It was opened in 1863. Like I said, it went from Paddington, here along this line, past Euston to King's Cross, St. Pancras, and then Farringdon. And we can see this here. We have the additional information that, for example, Baker Street was opened on the 10th of January 1863. And here, if we look at Paddington, we can see that there's a number of different stations historically that have carried the name Paddington, that have partly also changed their names. But this one here, opened as Paddington Bishops Road, is from the 10th of January 1863. So this is the old one. That's right here. This is the old one. And it was renamed Paddington in 1933. The Metropolitan is also interesting because these are not very deep tunnels. Initially, that is a technology that simply wasn't available. So instead, what they did is that they followed the streets in this area and used the so-called cut and cover method. So they would partly open the roads, create a tunnel, and then close it again. And these tunnels are right under the street surface, so they really aren't very deep. And they're also a bit bigger than what we are sometimes thinking of when we think of the London Underground. These are not really tubes in that sense, but a bit larger than that. The Metropolitan was extremely popular and very successful, extended in all directions. And one of the directions in which it extended was here, towards Harrow. And this area, this was a little bit outside, so these are suburbs. And these areas were actually bought by the Metropolitan Railway, which then redeveloped this land and called it Metroland. And for a long time, people actually would say they lived in Metroland because it sounded a bit cooler than saying they lived in the suburbs or in Harrow or Middlesex. So this is Metroland. And these were quite popular because, of course, the idea is that you have a new house, so everything was modern. It's in a beautiful countryside in the suburbs where things are quiet and peaceful. But you have the underground, and if you need to get to the city, you'll be there in no time. And that, I think, is actually quite a modern thought. Today in Vienna we have a city development project called the Seestadt, which is not that different from that. It's quite far outside of the center. Everything is brand new and modern. You have a little lake in the middle, and you have the underground taking you back into the center. So again, here with Metroland, quite modern thinking in the 19th century. As the Metropolitan line was quite successful, the idea was to also create another line here on the southern side of the city. And that today is the district line. You can see this here in green. The idea was to use the same method. You use these cut and cover tunnels, you follow the streets, and ideally it should have worked the way it worked on the northern part. However, the area is a bit different here, and it was a lot more expensive to create the same lines as in the north. Initially, the Metropolitan and the District line were two different companies, but with the idea that they would merge later. You had the director of one company on board of the other, you had the same engineers on both companies. But as it turned out, since this was so expensive and the District line really had some financial issues, the Metropolitan suddenly wasn't that interested anymore, and the merger never happened. If we look at the south, the District line opened in 1868 here from South Kensington. We have the information up here. It opened on the 24th of December 1868, and it went here to Westminster. So these were the first stops: South Kensington, Sloane Square, Victoria, St. James Park, and Westminster. But again, if we look at Embankment, this was opened in 1870, back then called Charing Cross. So just about 2 years later. Same goes for Temple and Blackfriars, Mansion House 1871, Cannon Street 1884, same for Monument, Tower Hill. So the extensions happened quite quickly. And you soon had at least almost a circle. By the end of the 19th century, there were 550 trains running through London every day. And people basically all got in the underground to get wherever they had to go. However, these subsurface lines, like the District line and the Metropolitan, were run with steam trains. And the tunnels could get quite uncomfortable, quite hot. There was a lot of smoke, and over time there were quite a lot of passenger complaints. So people looked for other possibilities on how to build a tube, and that's where our name tube comes from. In 1869, so actually just after the opening of the first underground lines, the so-called Tower subway was created. Now, that's not a subway in the way we think of it, but rather it was a tunnel under the River Thames, close to Tower Bridge. So I think somewhere in this area, if I'm not mistaken. It's about 410 meters long. It goes under the river. It used a so-called tunneling shield, which protected the workers as they tunneled through this clay and sand under the Thames. It initially was supposed to use a cable-hauled wooden carriage, so a small carriage that was pulled through the tunnel with a cable. However, it didn't fit very many people and wasn't very popular, and the company went bankrupt pretty much the same year. It was then opened as a pedestrian tunnel, but eventually closed in 1898. So it wasn't open very long. It's not necessarily a success story. However, it showed that it was possible to dig very, very deep tunnels under London. And that was then used to create an actual underground line. And the first one was the Northern Line. That's the one here in dark blue. And it was opened as a City and South London Railway. So it started here in the south and went up to the city. Now, this too was intended for cable-hauled trains, such as like the initial tunnel under the River Thames. Again, this wasn't possible, so what they did was that they used electric locomotives. This was brand new and a little experimental, but it worked out. The Northern Line opened here in 1890 from Stockwell to Oval to Kennington, and we can see here there are two different lines, one going this direction from 1890 and one going north, but this one's way younger, from 1926. So we're following the original one to Elephant and Castle, Borough, and then the first one went here to King William Street. This was opened in 1890 and closed in 1900, so just 10 years later, and the tunnel too has been closed. Instead, a new tunnel was created to London Bridge, and then north to Bank, here we are in 1900, and further north, Moorgate, Allstrade, City Road. This one too has been closed, specifically in 1922. To Angel, King's Crossing, Pancras, and in 1907 even reached Euston. Since then it's been extended further north, and a couple of other train lines quickly were added to this list. Now let's have a brief look at what this meant. If you visit the London Transport Museum or its depot, you can see some of these really old trailer cars, like this one from the Metropolitan line. This one is from 1904. And we also have one of the trains like they were used on the Northern Line. This one here is from the Piccadilly line, but the Piccadilly line too is one of these deep level tubes, so they used similar trains. And the way these worked is that they had seating like this, like you probably know. It's quite typical today for the London Underground. However, they had much smaller windows, as the thought was that there was not much to see in the tunnels. They were quite narrow and a bit higher up. About 32 people fit into a train of 3 carriages, and you could get in and off here at the end of the train. There was a gateman riding along on the train people would yell out the name of the stations and allow passengers to get on and off. The tube lines were popular, however, they were a bit claustrophobic and they were sometimes nicknamed padded cells, as you really were sort of squeezed in here with not much to see. Eventually they were refitted and today you can get off here on the sides. But these early tubes still exist even if the tunnels have been renovated and we have more modern vehicles. The reason that the London Underground feels a bit cramped and small is because these tunnels were created so early on. Another issue was how to get people to the new tubes. The elevator wasn't invented yet. So one of the experiments was the spiral elevator. This one here is from 1906. And you can see it looks a bit scary. There aren't any handrails, so you can't hold on. And it's all a bit primitive, I think. And indeed here it says it was never used for public service. There was no official reason given for abandoning the equipment, but perhaps the narrow walkways, noise and lack of handrails meant that elegant Edwardian Londoners simply did not feel comfortable using it. So we had a lot of staircases at the start, but of course today you can use elevators. I think it's quite fascinating when you look through these old machines, like these here from the 30s. How different everything looked, and also how elegant. By the 1930s, you had quite an extensive tube network. You can see this here on the geographical map of the city. You can see that here towards the southwest, towards the southeast, we don't really have any tube connections. Still the case today. But the city is quite dense, and then some of the lines go quite far out. Initially these were private companies, but eventually were put together under one roof, and you could use the same tickets with one system to use all of the underground. You also soon have sort of these typical roundel. It says underground. Today you would have it with the names of the stations in the station, so you know where you are. You can see here that it developed over time. This one's from 96, Leicester Square. And today in total there are 11 lines over 272 stations. The Metropolitan line and the District line are the subsurface lines. The Metropolitan and the District line are the subsurface lines. Plus additionally, there's the Circle line, which is not included here, and Hammersmith and City. Hammersmith is here. And you can see that this is listed as part of the Metropolitan, which for a long time it was. Today Hammersmith and City and the Circle line are two independent lines, but they share the tunnels and stations with the Metropolitan and the District line. Of the deep level tubes, we have the Bakerloo line, which is this one here, from Elephant and Castle past Waterloo, Embankment, Charing Cross, Piccadilly Circus and Oxford Circus, Regent's Park, Baker Street, Marylebone, Edgware Road, Paddington, and then north towards Harrow and Wealdstone. This one was opened in 1906. Then in red we have the Central line, which has two different starts which connect at North Acton and then continue past Shepherd's Bush, Notting Hill Gate, Queensway and Lancaster Gate, Bond Street, Oxford Circus, Tottenham Court Road. Here we have an old station that was closed right at the British Museum. We have Holborn, Chancery Lane, St Paul's, Bank, Liverpool Street, Bethnal Green, Mile End, and then continue north past Stratford. The Central Line's from 1900. The Northern Line, we already said, is from 1890 and goes from Morden to High Barnet or Edgware. The Piccadilly line is the one that you might get on when you arrive at London if you start at Heathrow. The oldest stations are from 1906, Heathrow's a bit younger, 1977. And again it takes you past Hammersmith, Barons Court, where we hear back at the very, very old lines, 1906, Earls Court, Gloucester Road, South Kensington, close stop at Brompton Road, Knightsbridge, Hyde Park Corner, close station at Down Street, Green Park, Piccadilly Circus, Leicester Square, Covent Garden, Holborn, Russell Square, King's Crossing, Pancras, and then north towards Cockfosters. Then we have Waterloo in City, which opened in 1898 at Waterloo, logically. However, the tunnel here is from 1994, going up to Bank. And then we lose the Waterloo and City line. I'm not actually sure where it continues, but I assume that it shares some other connections with other tube lines. So these are the older tubes. And it took a while past the First and Second World War until new train lines were built. It became pretty clear quite early on that they needed more connections as the tubes were quite full most of the time. Plans date back from the 1940s, however, it took a while until these new lines could be built. These are two lines, the Victoria from 1968 and the Jubilee line from 1979. Now the Victoria line is here in bright blue from Brixton. Up here to Victoria, of course, Green Park, Oxford Circus, Warren Street, Euston, King's Crossing, Pancras, up to Finsbury Park, Seven Sisters, Tottenham Hill, Black Horse Road and Walthamstow Central. And the Jubilee line in silver starts here at Stanmore, Cannons Park, Queensbury, Kingsbury, Wembley Park. These are all much older stations, as you can see. They date to the 30s. So that was initially part of the Metropolitan. But here we passed Baker Street, Bond Street, Green Park. And then this is even from 1999 to Westminster, Waterloo, South Park, London Bridge, Bermondsey, and out to Canada Water, past West Ham to Stratford. In fact, there are a couple more connections that are also not listed here. You have the Overground, part of which is listed here, a couple of closed stations, but largely not included on the map. You also here in the area of Canary Wharf, you have the DLR, which is not listed. It's an automatic train that goes up here. I think it actually connects to Stratford and to the city airport. So in this area where you don't have a lot of tubes, quite useful. And you also have the brand new Elizabeth line. Now, part of the reason this is not included here might be because the Elizabeth line opened this year, just 6 weeks ago, and in the center it uses some of the other stations, like for example here at Canary Wharf. It also goes all the way to Heathrow, so you're not reliant exclusively on the Piccadilly line, which is quite good. And it also uses some of the rail lines further out. However, they did create new tunnels through the centre. So the Elizabeth line, which was previously called Crossrail, connects West and East London and then goes past the borders of the actual city. Of course, you have plenty of different kinds of trains. This quite famous color scheme that you see here on the Victoria line. And then also some of the unpainted aluminium cars from the 50s. However, it was difficult to remove graffitis, so they went back to using paint. And then, of course, when it comes to public transport, you also have the famous trolley buses in London. The famous red colour. And you have a couple of really interesting maps and models if you do have a chance to visit the museum. Like here, Piccadilly Circus. This is a station reconstruction from 1927. It was created by Harold Harding. Together with his wife, he later became one of the country's leading civil engineers and was knighted for his achievement. And what I really like about this model here is just how busy it is. You have tons of trolley buses here in the streets. You have the different entrances here, or here. A circulating area where you have change kiosks, automatic booking offices, tobacco food and confectionery stalls, switch house. Underneath there's the machinery floor. And then you have tons and tons of staircases and escalators down to the subway. You have the Piccadilly line on one side, eastbound and westbound, and the Bakerloo line on the other side, southbound and northbound, with interchanges if you want to change from the Bakerloo to the Piccadilly without going to the surface. And you also have one of these staircases in case you can't use an escalator. And there's people absolutely everywhere, on every platform, every staircase, every escalator. So very, very busy. Of course, today you don't buy your ticket here anymore at one of these beautiful booking office windows. You can get it straight at the airport and then just tap it when you go in. And then you're off to wherever you want to go. Alright, so that was a brief look at the very rich and complex history of the London Underground. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you're interested in London, then come back next week. We'll have another look at its history. Until then, thank you for watching. Good night and sleep well.